Welcome back to MyNewsReal. We're in conversation with none other than Apostle Demetris Burke. Apostle Burke, at the ending of the last clip, you used the word influence a number of times. You talked about the influence that the streets had on you. You talked about the influences in the prison environment. You talked about your influence upon situations. And I think it's sort of important now that we explore a little bit about what is influence and how are you defining it as it regards your life?
That's good. I often go back to Matthew 5. It talks about salt and light. That salt is one influence, meaning that connection with you and the next person, and allowing that influence to be according now to something that's positive. But when I was in the world, it was a desire that drew me, and usually I was drawn by someone else's influence.
Wow.
But it was still at the root of my desire. So now when Jesus talks about we're the salt of the earth, the light of the world, now that salt becomes an influence that preserves an individual to be a positive aspect concerning sustaining that which is sustaining, which is Christ in us. That's the key piece now about the salt, which is one influence.
So you're saying that influence, someone can come along that touches something in our inner man.
True.
That could be lying dormant, that we may or may not even know is there. But it can sort of, you used to use a word called pinging,
Right.
could connect with something in us that could cause an inner desire that we have to be made manifest, be it good or bad.
That's key. That's why he mentions salt and light together. That light is when you're speaking, people have a tendency to say, well, I want to speak over your life. But in reality, they're speaking life to life. When you're coming with your salt and your light, your influence and the light that you bear will trigger something in someone else. And they say that a study has shown that we come in contact with like 250 people intimately in our life. And they use that in a biblical text when Peter stood with the 11. And they said when he stood with the 11, the anointings overlapped. And 250 times 12 equals 3,000. And that 3,000 people came into the kingdom during the time that Peter himself stood up. But the other 11 was in sync with him. Those overlapping anointings, that salt, that influence, and that light coming together to spread out enough that 3,000 people came into the kingdom by one man speaking.
Now, it's interesting that you would talk about overlapping and all of that because a lot of people really think ministry is really captured in a bottle that says church. And that is like the only portal that the Lord uses to minister to people, is that you got to be a pastor in a church or you got to be an evangelist, quote unquote, with the titles. But I do believe that God is calling us that we're in a season for the full manifestation of another type of approach to ministry or perspective about calling and ministry.
That is so true. Again, back to the Great Commission. And in that Great Commission, he speaks about nations. And he says, discipling nations. I shall be with you to the ends of the earth. And that's true. A lot of times we get the work of ministry tied into the work one has been called to do. The distinction is the work of the ministry is the overall evangelizing of all saints. To go out, teach the gospel, or just minister to someone about Jesus. But then there's a work that one has been called to do. That's what God has created them to do. And that is not limited to what we call the church mountain. You know, one can be called to media. And he's good at dealing with media. One could be called to family or government. Still not taken away from where they come from, which is the church. But they're not limited to church, the work of the ministry within the church, which we call the fivefold ministry. Some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. A study has shown that only 20% of believers are called to the fivefold ministry. The other 80% should be in the marketplace. And that's a serious study if you think about it. What we have a tendency of doing is going out evangelizing people, bringing them back to the church, and putting them in church ministry. So there's a hunger stirring in them because that salt that they have is access to someone else outside of the church mountain. So that becomes a key piece.
Talk about, you said marketplace. Some of the MyNewsReal family may not understand, what do you mean when you say marketplace ministry? Kind of.
Again, the call that's on their life in those 7 mountains, they call it. If people talk about 7 mountains mandate, those are just mind molders of society that believers have been called. Actually, a lot of believers have been working in the marketplace anyway. And when they received salvation, a lot of them took away from what they've been called to do and started doing ministry in the church and taking away from their regular calling.
Because we've so narrowly sometimes defined ministry that the passion that pushes us to salvation in search of the transformation.
That's it.
And we sometimes feel like the transformation can only take place if we are literally hands-on in a church preaching our beliefs, when it's really a lifestyle, is it not?
It really is. If you look at Jesus when he called the 12, they were all common. They was what they call the secular world, the very thing now that most believers say we shouldn't mess with that because that's secular. But actually, in actuality, Jesus chose his 12 from the secular. He didn't choose them from the synagogues or the temples. So, and he was to go out, and they was to go out to effect the entire nations. And nations, every nation consists of these mind molders, whether it's media, whether it's arts and entertainment, the movies. We should be able to go see a movie where there's believers there in the movies doing any type of acting, but long as they're not compromising their call, and they're still giving Christ the glory, giving Jesus the glory for just being in a movie, having a believer there to influence everyone within that cast. So that's another thing. We have that salt in us, that light in us, to be effective and to affect any society, realm of society that we go into.
Talk to us about how did we end up this way? I mean, there are so many expressions of our daddy.
Yes, it is.
You cannot even walk outside the door without seeing an expression of him.
Yes.
From the sky, the trees, the flowers, the plants.
So true.
If you really try to intellectualize how plants grow and flowers blossom and bloom and how animals get their color and their behaviors and all this, it took an absolutely brilliant mind to do this, quotes upon mind, or creator to do this. So if he is so amazingly wonderful, what happened to his reflection of himself, us?
Whoa.
When it comes to us understanding that he is every place and in all things, and not in a building, because we are the church, right?
That's true.
So if we are the church, then we are convened in a building. So the church comes together in a building. So where 2 or 3 are gathered, he's in the midst. So no matter where we are, if we're the church, he's there. How did we box and boundary in our beliefs so tightly that it's caused people to have weights, that heavy weights that they carry about this?
That transition from what I call it from Pentecost, Acts 2 to now, we still held on to that.
Say that one more time.
From Acts 2 forward, we didn't transition into the grace.
Okay, I want you to look in that camera and minister that piece to them.
From Acts 2 forward.
From my listening audience, from my NewsReal family, look into that camera and minister that to them.
Well, I think we're out to lunch on the extension from law to grace. What I mean by that, Paul mentions about the manifold grace of God. That is really saying that all of us have a distinct thing about us that God has put in us. And when we accept Christ, Christ in us becomes the hope of glory. Not just for the church, it's for the entire world. He so loved the world that he gave himself. So what that is saying is, each of us being a diverse grace or a diverse exemplary of Christ, we're supposed to be touching every area that molds and shapes the minds of society. And that's the beauty that the church has, the advantage, because we are the equipping place to equip saints to go out, to influence any realm of society. And that's what we got it boxed in, that we still got that Older Testament mentality where we kind of still put them in the Ark of the Covenant, still put them in the box. And I love what David did when they say he danced out of his robe. He showed a different demeanor than a normal king would do. So what we're having, the issue is boxing in God, putting God in the box. And that box has become the church. And as beautiful as we are in Christ, we have access to go out and touch all realms of society. He says, disciple nation by teaching them. Teaching them what? The very exemplary of what Christ taught. Love, grace, mercy. The extension from one person to the next according to Christ in us being the hope of glory.